10 whitest states in the United States. Shades of White. Unveiling the history of the top 10 whitest states in America. Are you curious about the states where white means more than just winter snow? We'll look at the percentage of the population that is white. The two most important items in the history of North American colonization are the Mayflower, which was followed by the Spanish and St. Augustine. Whatever the story, white people took over, and what is now the United States has remained white ever since. Today, we'll look at 10 states where the percentages haven't changed significantly since the 1700s. Watch for number 1, it's going to surprise you. Let's take a look. Number 10. Nebraska is predominantly white, and it tops our list. By the 1870s, Nebraska's European immigrant population had peaked, and around 25% of the state's residents were born in another nation. The majority of the early newcomers to Nebraska were Danes, Swedes, Irish, Germans, and Czechs. If you need further proof that Nebraska is predominantly white, consider this. The most popular male name in Nebraska is Oliver, followed by Henry and Liam. Theodore is ranked 4th. Nebraska has an 88.1% white population. Number 9. Kentucky, the bluegrass state, where English, Scottish, and Irish settlers developed a cultural identity as diverse as its world-famous bluegrass music. Kentucky is the birthplace of bourbon, bluegrass, and Louisville Slugger baseball bats. According to the most recent ACS census data, Kentucky's unique cultural landscape includes an 87% self-identifying white population. Number 8. Montana joins the blonde-haired blue-eye crowd. Originally, Italians and Germans lived in Fergus and Park counties. Many Germans came from North Dakota and Canada, while the majority of cattlemen who arrived in Montana were English and Scottish. Back then, the English and Scottish mainly worked the cattle, while the owners were typically German. They had sheepmen. Sheepmen were not typically tolerated back in the day. The cattlemen didn't like them, but there were a lot of them in Montana, and they were from the British Isles. That is how Montana became the state it is today. White people make up 88.9% of Montana's population. Number 7. Idaho has a reputation for being extremely white. That has always been the case. The majority of the settlers in the late 19th and early 20th century were English. Because there wasn't any governance back then, this seemed like a wonderfully great area to many people before statehood. The majority of the English from jolly old England were being taxed to death, and a nation with almost no government appeared to be a lovely place to live. White people make about 93% of Idaho's population. Number 6. Iowa. You've never been to an Iowa county fair if you didn't know the state is predominantly white. I honestly assumed this video would be number 1 before I started researching it. I've gone to Iowa a few times, and it's definitely the largest state I've ever seen, in my opinion. The stats do not match my opinion, hence they are ranked 7th. Back in the 1840s, the majority of the settlers who arrived to Iowa were from Scandinavian countries. Some came from the Netherlands, Germany, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. New Englanders arrived at the same period, along with Quakers in 1941, and Mormons arrived around 1846. Yes, there are a significant number of Mormons in Iowa. Nothing like what Utah has, but it's close. Currently, 90.6% of Iowa's population is white.
While we carry on, please consider subscribing to our channel if you found this video to be informative and beneficial. Thank you.
Number 5. Wyoming. The early immigrants of Wyoming were divided into 6 groups. The British, Germans, Italians, Basques, and Greeks arrived in 1870. Immigrants from the British Isles made up roughly 1/5 of Wyoming's territorial population and more than half of its foreign-born population. As a result, the British arrived in force. Wyoming has been quite popular with almost everyone in recent decades, yet 92.5% of their people is now defined as white. Number 4. New Hampshire. This is another state that should come as no surprise to anyone who has visited New Hampshire. You already know if you live there. I mean, we're talking about a state where Taco Bell is considered diverse. New Hampshire, as part of New England, plainly dates back to colonial times, and at the time, the majority of individuals in the area that would later become New Hampshire were British. However, in 1799, they were joined there by a large number of Scottish and Irish immigrants. What's funny is that for a long time, there were a lot of French Canadians living in New Hampshire, and you could sometimes find little bits and pieces of that culture there. They came down from Quebec for the textile factories, and many of them stayed. In the past, 93.1% of New Hampshire's population was deemed white. Number 3. West Virginia. West Virginia is an odd state. I expected a greater percentage since, unlike other cities in the United States, West Virginia cities lack diversity. And there is almost no diversity outside of towns, especially in rural places like the Highlands and Hollers. So I'm amazed they're third on this list. The development of modern-day West Virginia began in the mid-1700s, when Scottish, Irish, and German settlers from Pennsylvania arrived in what is now Berkeley and Greenbrier counties. The Scottish and Irish cultures were deeply ingrained in the West Virginia landscape. A lot of the folk music in this section of the country is heavily influenced by Scottish and Irish. Currently, 93.5% of West Virginia's population is white. Number 2. Vermont. Do you recall all I said about New Hampshire? In Vermont, it's the same. That seems to be the case all the time. They're immediately next to each other, and they always tend to appear close together in lists. Look at their crime statistics, school grades, and economies. They're always right next to each other on whatever statistic we're looking at. Like New Hampshire, the area was eventually colonized by the English, Irish, and Scottish, and they also had a fair proportion of French Canadians who came down from Quebec. Currently, 94.2% of Vermont's population is classified as white. Number 1. Maine. Look at that. New England has 3 of the top 4 states on this list. And if you've ever visited New England, you're probably not surprised, particularly when it comes to Maine. First and foremost, Portland, Maine's largest city, has a population of less than 70,000 people. The metro area as a whole has a population of around 556,000 people. However, the white population of Portland, Maine is 91.27%. That is extremely high for a city. To be sure, this isn't urban sprawl or anything like that. It remains a city. If you look at the other Portland in Oregon, it has a white population of roughly 76 people. Oregon was almost included on this list. It ranks similarly to number 14. Portland, Oregon is obviously far larger, but it's still a fascinating contrast. The Pine Tree State has a 94.4% white population. Outro. Okay, that's it for today's video. What ethnicity, culture, or religion should we focus on if we do another of these? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. I hope you had a good time. Thank you for your time.